Chapter 1 of Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers by Charles Bradlaugh. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers by Charles Bradlaugh. Chapter 1. Thomas Hobbes. This distinguished freethinker was born on the 5th of April, 1588, at Malmesbury, hence his cognomen of the philosopher of Malmesbury. In connection with his birth, we are told that his mother, being a loyal Protestant, was so terrified at the rumored approach of the Spanish Armada, that the birth of her son was hastened in consequence. The subsequent timidity of Hobbes is therefore easily accounted for. The foundation of his education was laid in the grammar school of his native town, where most probably his father, being a clergyman, would officiate as tutor. At the age of 15 he was sent to Oxford. 5 years of assiduous study made him proficient as a tutor. This, combined with his amiability and profound views of society, gained him the respect of the Earl of Devonshire, and he was appointed tutor to the Earl's son, Lord Cavendish. From 1610 to 1628 he was constantly in the society of this nobleman, in the capacity of secretary. In the interval of this time, he travelled in France, Germany, and Italy, cultivating in each capital the society of the leading statesmen and philosophers. Lord Herbert of Cherbury, the first great English deist, and Ben Jonson, the dramatist, were each his boon companions. In the year 1628, Hobbes again made the tour of the continent for 3 years with another pupil, and became acquainted at Pisa with Galileo. In 1631 he was entrusted with the education of another youth of the Devonshire family, and for near 5 years remained at Paris with his pupil. Hobbes returned to England in 1636. The troublous politics of this age, with its strong party prejudices, made England the reverse of a pleasant retirement, for either Hobbes or his patrons. So, perceiving the outbreak of the Revolution, he emigrated to Paris. There, in the enjoyment of the company of Gassendi and Descartes, with the elite of Parisian genius, he was for a while contented and happy. Here he engaged in a series of mathematical quarrels, which were prolonged throughout the whole of his life, on the quadrature of the circle. 7 years after, he was appointed mathematical tutor to the Prince of Wales, afterwards Charles II. In 1642 Hobbes published the first of his principal works, De Cive, or Philosophical Rudiments Concerning Government and Society. It was written to curb the spirit of anarchy, then so rampant in England, by exposing the inevitable results which must of necessity spring from the want of a coherent government amongst a people disunited and uneducated. The principles inculcated in this work were reproduced in the year 1651 in the Leviathan, or the Matter, Form, and Power of a Commonwealth, Ecclesiastical and Civil. This, along with a treatise on human nature, and a small work on the body politic, form the groundwork of the selfish schools of moral philosophy. As soon as they were published, they were attacked by the clergy of every country in Europe. They were interdicted by the pontiffs of the Roman and Greek Church, along with the Protestants scattered over Europe, and the episcopal authorities of England. Indeed, to such an extent did this persecution rise, that even the royalist exiles received warning that there was no chance for their ostracism being removed, unless the unclean thing, Hobbes, was put away from their midst. The young prince, intimidated by those ebullitions of vengeance against his tutor, was obliged to withdraw his protection from him, and the old man, then near 70 years of age, was compelled to escape from Paris by night, pursued by his enemies, who, according to Lord Clarendon, tracked his footsteps from France. Fortunately for Hobbes, he took refuge with his old protectors, the Devonshire family, who were too powerful to be wantonly insulted. While residing at Chatsworth, he would no doubt acutely feel the loss of Descartes, the Cardinal de Richelieu, and Gassendi. In the place of those men he entered into a warm friendship with Cowley the poet, Selden, Harvey, the discoverer of the circulation of blood, Charles Blount, and the witty Sir Thomas Browne. In 1654 he published a Letter upon Liberty and Necessity. This brief tractate is unsurpassed in Freethought literature, for its clear, concise, subtle, and demonstrative proofs of the self-determining power of the will, and the truth of philosophical necessity. All subsequent writers on this question have largely availed themselves of Hobbes' arguments, particularly the pamphleteers of Socialism. It is a fact no less true than strange, that communism is derived from the system of Hobbes, which has always been classed along with that of Machiavelli as an apology for despotism. The grand peculiarity of Hobbes is his method. Instead of taking speculation and reasoning upon theories, he carried out the inductive system of Bacon in its entirety, reasoning from separate generic facts instead of analogically. By this means he narrowed the compass of knowledge, and made everything demonstrative that was capable of proof. Belief was consequently placed upon its proper basis, and a rigid analysis separated the boundaries of knowing and being. Hobbes looked at the great end of existence, and embodied it in a double axiom. First, the desire for self-preservation. Second, to render ourselves happy. From those duplex principles, which are inherent in all animals, a modern politician has perpetrated a platitude which represents in a sentence the end and aim of all legislation: the greatest happiness for the greatest number. This is the ultimatum of Hobbes' philosophy. Its method of accomplishment was by treating society as one large family, with the educated and skilled as governors, having under their care the training of the nation. All acting from one impulse, self-preservation, and by the conjoint experience of all, deriving the greatest amount of happiness from this activity. Hobbes opposed the Revolution because it degenerated into a faction, and supported Charles Stuart because there were more elements of cohesion within his own party than amongst his enemies. It was here where the cry of despotism arose. The Roundheads, seeing they could not detach the ablest men from the king's party, denounced their literary opponents as lovers of Belial and of tyranny. This was their most effective answer to the Leviathan. In after years, when the Episcopal party no longer stood in need of the services of Hobbes, they heaped upon him the stigma of heresy, until his cideviant friends and enemies were united in the condemnation of the man they most feared. Mr. Owen, in his Schema of Socialism, took his leading idea on non-responsibility from Hobbes' explanation of necessity, and the freedom of the will. The old divines had inculcated a doctrine to the effect that the will was a separate entity of the human mind, which swayed the whole disposition, and was of itself essentially corrupt. Ample testimony from the Bible substantiated this position. But in the method of Hobbes, he lays down the facts that we can have no knowledge without experience, and no experience without sensation. The mind, therefore, is composed of classified sensations, united together by the law of an association of ideas. This law was first discovered by Hobbes, who makes the human will to consist in the strongest motive which sways the balance on any side. This is the simplest explanation which can be given on a subject more mystified than any other in theology. A long controversy betwixt Bishop Bramhall of Londonderry followed the publication of Hobbes' views on liberty and necessity. Charles II, on his restoration, bestowed an annual pension of £100 on Hobbes. But this did not prevent the Parliament, in 1666, censuring the De Cive and Leviathan, besides his other works. Hobbes also translated the Greek historian Thucydides, Homer's Odyssey, and the Iliad. The last years of his life were spent in composing Behemoth, or A History of the Civil Wars from 1640 to 1660, which was finished in the year he died, but not published until after his death. At the close of the year 1679, he was taken seriously ill. At the urgent request of some Christians, they were permitted to intrude their opinions upon his dying bed, telling him gravely that his illness would end in death, and unless he repented he would go straight to hell. Hobbes calmly replied, "I shall be glad then to find a hole to creep out of the world." For 70 years he had been a persecuted man, but during that time his enemies had paid him that tribute of respect which genius always extorts from society. He was a man who was hated and dreaded. He had reached the age of 92 when he died. His words were pregnant with meaning, and he never used an unnecessary sentence. A collection of moral apothegms might be gathered from his table talk. When asked why he did not read every new book which appeared, he said, "If I had read as much as other men, I should have been as ignorant." His habits were simple. He rose early in the morning, took a long walk through the grounds of Chatsworth, and cultivated healthful recreation. The after part of the day was devoted to study and composition. Like Sir Walter Raleigh, he was a devoted admirer of the fragrant herb. Charles II's constant witticism styled Hobbes as a bear against whom the church played their young dogs in order to exercise them. If there had been a few more similar bears, the priestly dogs would long since have been exterminated, for none of them escaped unhurt from their encounters with the grizzly of Malmesbury, except it was in the mathematical disputes of Dr. Wallace. He was naturally of a timid disposition. This was the result of the accident which caused his premature birth, and being besides of a reserved character, he was ill fitted to meet the physical rebuffs of the world. It is said that he was so afraid of his personal safety that he objected to be left alone in an empty house. This charge is to some extent true, but we must look to the mitigating circumstances of the case. He was a feeble man, turned the age of 70, with all the clergy of England hounding on their dupes to murder an old philosopher, because he had exposed their dogmas. It was but a few years before that Protestants and Papists had complimented each other's religion by burning those who were the weakest, and long after Hobbes' death, Protestants murdered, ruined, disgraced, and placed in the pillory dissenters and Catholics alike, and Thomas Hobbes had positive proof that it was the intention of the Church of England to burn him alive on the stake, a martyr for his opinions. This, then, is a sufficient justification for Hobbes feeling afraid, and instead of it being thrown as a taunt at this illustrious Freethinker, it is a standing stigma on those who would reenact the tragedy of persecution, if public opinion would allow it. Sir James Mackintosh says, "The style of Hobbes is the very perfection of didactic language. Short, clear, precise, pithy, his language never has more than one meaning, which never requires a second thought to find. By the help of his exact method, it takes so firm a hold on the mind, that it will not allow attention to slacken. His little tract on human nature has scarcely an ambiguous or a needless word. He has so great a power of always choosing the most significant term, that he never is reduced to the poor expedient of using many in its stead. He had so thoroughly studied the genius of the language, and knew so well how to steer between pedantry and vulgarity, that 2 centuries have not superannuated probably more than a dozen of his words." From the second dissertation, Encyclopaedia Britannica, page 318. Lord Clarendon describes the personal character of Hobbes as one for whom he always had a great esteem as a man, who, besides his eminent parts of learning and knowledge, hath been always looked upon as a man of probity, and a life free from scandal." We now proceed to make a selection of quotations from the works of this writer, commencing with those on the necessity of the will, in reply to Bishop Bramhall. "The question is not whether a man be a free agent, that is to say, whether he can write or forbear, speak or be silent, according to his will, but whether the will to write and the will to forbear come upon him according to his will, or according to anything else in his own power. I acknowledge this liberty that I can do if I will, but to say I can will if I will, I take to be an absurd speech." Further replying to Bramhall's argument that we do not learn the idea of the freedom of the will from our tutors, but we know it intuitively, Hobbes says, "It is very true few have learned from tutors that a man is not free to will, nor do they find it much in books. That they, and in books that which the poets chaunt in the theatres, and the shepherds on the mountains, that which the pastors teach in the churches, and the doctors in the universities, and that which the common people in the markets, and all the people do assent to, is the same that I assent to, namely, that a man hath freedom to do if he will. But whether he hath freedom to will, is a question which it seems neither the bishop nor they ever thought of. A wooden top that is lashed by the boys, and runs about, sometimes to one wall, sometimes to another, sometimes spinning, sometimes hitting men on the shins, if it were sensible of its own motion, would think it proceeded from its own will, unless it felt what lashed it. And is a man any wiser when he runs to one place for a benefice, to another for a bargain, and troubles the world with writing errors and requiring answers, because he thinks he does it without other cause than his own will, and seeth not what are the lashings which cause that will?" Hobbes casually mentions the subject of praise or dispraise in his reference to the will. Those who are old enough will remember this was one of the most frequent subjects of discussion amongst the earlier Socialists. These depend not at all in the necessity of the action praised or dispraised. For what is it else to praise but to say a thing is good? Good, I say, for me, or for somebody else, or for the state and commonwealth. And what is it to say an action is good, but to say it is as I would wish, or as another would have it, or according to the will of the state, that is to say, according to the law? Does my Lord think that no action could please me or the commonwealth that should proceed from necessity? Things may be therefore necessary, and yet praiseworthy, and also necessary, and yet dispraised, and neither of them both in vain, because praise and dispraise, and likewise reward and punishment, do by example make and conform the will to good or evil. It was a very great praise, in my opinion, that Valerius Paterculus gives Cato, when he says that he was good by nature, et quia aliter esse non potui, and because he could not do otherwise. This able treatise was reprinted and extensively read about 20 years ago, but, like many other of our standard works, is at present out of print. The Leviathan is still readable, a bold masculine book. It treats everything in a cool, analytical style. The knife of the Socialist is sheathed in vain. No rhapsody can overturn its impassioned teachings. Rhetoric is not needed to embellish the truths he has to portray, for the wild flowers of genius but too frequently hide the yawning chasms in the garden of logic. It is not to be expected that this book will be read now with the interest with which it was perused 2 centuries ago. Then every statement was impugned, every argument denied, and the very tone of the book called forth an interference from Parliament to stop the progress of its heresies. Now the case is widely different, and the general tenor of the treatise is the rule in which are illustrated alike the works of the philosophers and the dreams of the sophists (priests). We give part of the introduction. Nature, the art whereby God hath made and governs the world, is, by the art of man, as in many other things, so in this also, imitated, that it can make an artificial animal. For seeing life is but a motion of limbs, the beginning whereof is in some principal part within. Why may we not say that all automata, engines that move themselves by springs and wheels, as doth a watch, have an artificial life? For what is the heart but a spring, and the nerves but so many strings, and the joints but so many wheels, giving motion to the whole body, such as was intended by the artificer? Art goes yet further, imitating that rational and most excellent work of nature, man. For by art is created that great Leviathan, called a commonwealth or state, which is but an artificial man, though of greater stature and strength than the natural, for whose protection and defense it was intended, and the sovereignty of which is an artificial soul, as giving life and motion to the whole body. To describe the nature of this artificial man, I will consider first the matter, therefore, and the artificer, both which is man. Second, how and by what covenants it is made, what are the rights and just power of authority of a sovereign, and what it is that preserveth and dissolveth it. Third, what is a Christian commonwealth? Lastly, what is the kingdom of darkness? The first chapter treats of senses. Concerning the thoughts of man, I will consider them first singly, and afterwards in train or dependence upon one another. Singly, they are every one a representation or appearance of some quality or accident of a body without us, which is commonly called an object. Which object worketh on the eyes, ears, and other parts of a man's body, and by diversity of working produceth diversity of appearances. The original of them all is that which we call sense. For there is no conception in a man's mind, which hath not at first totally or by parts been begotten unto the organs of sense. The rest are derived from that original. Speaking of imagination, Hobbes says, that when a thing lies still, unless somewhat else stir it, it will lie still forever, is a truth no one doubts of. But that when a thing is in motion, it will eternally be in motion, unless somewhat else stay it, though the reason be the same, namely, that nothing can change itself, is not so easily assented to. For men measure not only other men, but all other things by themselves. And because they find themselves subject, after motion, to pain and lassitude, think everything else grows weary of motion, and seeks repose of its own accord, little considering whether it be not some other motion, wherein that desire of rest they find in themselves consisteth. When a body is once in motion, it moveth, unless something else hinder it, eternally. And whatsoever hindereth it cannot in an instant, but in time, and by degrees, quite extinguish it. And as we see in the water, though the wind cease, the waves give not over rolling for a long time after. So also it happeneth in that motion which is made of the internal parts of man then, when he sees, dreams, etc. For after the object is removed, or the eye shut, we still retain an image of the thing seen, though more obscure than when we see it. The decay of sense in men waking is not the decay of the motion made in sense, but an obscuring of it, in such manner as the light of the sun obscureth the light of the stars, which stars do no less exercise their virtue, by which they are visible in the day than in the night. but because amongst many strokes which our eyes, ears, and other organs receive from external bodies, the predominant only is sensible. Therefore, the light of the sun being only predominant, we are not affected with the actions of the stars. This decaying sense, when we would express the thing itself, I mean fancy itself, we call imagination, as I said before, but when we would express the decay and signify the senses fading, old, and past, it is called memory. So that imagination and memory are but one thing, which, for diverse considerations, hath diverse names. Such is the commencement of this celebrated book. It is based upon materialism. Every argument must stand this test upon Hobbes' principles, and characteristically are they elaborated. Hobbes de Sive says of the immortality of the soul, "It is a belief grounded upon other men's sayings, that they knew it supernaturally, or that they knew those who knew them, that knew others, that knew it supernaturally." A sparkling sneer, and perhaps the truest answer to so universal an error. Dugald Stewart, in his analysis of the works of Hobbes, says, "The fundamental doctrines inculcated in the political works of Hobbes are contained in the following propositions: All men are by nature equal, and, prior to government, they had all an equal right to enjoy the good things of this world. Man, too, is by nature a solitary and purely selfish animal, the social union being entirely an interested league, suggested by prudential views of personal advantage. The necessary consequence is, that a state of nature must be a state of perpetual warfare, in which no individual has any other means of safety than his own strength or ingenuity, and in which there is no room for regular industry, because no secure enjoyment of its fruits." In confirmation of this view of the origin of society, Hobbes appeals to facts falling daily within the cycle of our experience. Does not a man, he asks, when taking a journey, arm himself and seek to go well accompanied? When going to sleep, does he not lock his doors? Nay, even in his own house, does he not lock his chests? Does he not there accuse mankind by his actions, as I do by my words? For the sake of peace and security, it is necessary that each individual should surrender a part of his natural right, and be contented with such a share of liberty as he is willing to allow to others; or, to use Hobbes' own language, every man must divest himself of the right he has to all things by nature, the right of all men to all things being in effect no better than if no man had a right to anything. In consequence of this transference of natural rights to an individual, or to a body of individuals, the multitude become one person under the name of a state or republic, by which person the common will and power are exercised for the common defense. The ruling power cannot be withdrawn from those to whom it has been committed, nor can they be punished for misgovernment. The interpretation of the laws is to be sought, not from the comments of philosophers, but from the authority of the ruler. Otherwise, society would every moment be in danger of resolving itself into the discordant elements of which it was first composed. The will of the magistrate, therefore, is to be regarded as the ultimate standard of right and wrong, and his voice to be listened to by every citizen as the voice of conscience. Leviathan, edition 1651. From the Dissertation on the Progress of Ethical Science, page 41. Such are the words of one of Hobbes' most powerful opponents. Dr. Warburton says, "The philosopher of Malmesbury was the terror of the last age, as Tyndall and Collins are of this. The press sweats with controversy, and every young churchman militant would try his arms in thundering on Hobbes' steel cap." This is a modest acknowledgment of the power of Hobbes, from the most turbulent divine of the 18th century. Victor Commian gives the following as his view of the philosophy of Hobbes. There is no other certain evidence than that of the senses. The evidence of the senses attests only the existence of bodies. Then there is no existence save that of bodies, and philosophy is only the science of bodies. There are two sorts of bodies. First, natural bodies, which are the theatre of a multitude of regular phenomena, because they take place by virtue of fixed laws, as the bodies with which physics are occupied. Second, moral and political bodies, societies which constantly change and are subject to variable laws. Hobbes' system of physics is that of Democritus, the atomistic and corpuscular of the Ionic school. His metaphysics are its corollary. All the phenomena which pass in the consciousness have their source in the organization, of which the consciousness in itself is simply a result. All the ideas come from the senses. To think is to calculate, and the intelligence is nothing else than an arithmetic. As we do not calculate without signs, we do not think without words. The truth of the thought is in the relation of the words among themselves, and metaphysics are reduced to a perfect language. Hobbes is completely a nominalist. With Hobbes there are no other than contingent ideas. The finite alone can be conceived. The infinite is only a negation of the finite. Beyond that, it is a mere word invented to honor a being whom faith alone can reach. The idea of good and evil has no other foundation than agreeable or disagreeable sensations. To agreeable or disagreeable sensation it is impossible to apply any other law than escape from the one and search after the other. Hence the morality of Hobbes, which is the foundation of his politics. Man is capable of enjoying and of suffering. His only law is to suffer as little and enjoy as much as possible. Since such is his only law, he has all the rights that this law confers upon him. He may do anything for his preservation and his happiness. He has the right to sacrifice everything to himself. Behold, then, men upon this earth, where the objects of desire are not superabundant, all possessing equal rights to whatever may be agreeable or useful to them, by virtue of the same capacity for enjoyment and suffering. This is a state of nature, which is nothing less than a state of war, the anarchy of the passions, a combat in which every man is arrayed against his neighbor. But this state being opposed to the happiness of the majority of individuals who share it, utility, the offspring of egotism itself, demands its exchange for another, to wit, the social state. The social state is the institution of a public power, stronger than all individuals, capable of making peace succeed war, and imposing on all the accomplishment of whatever it shall have judged to be useful, that is, just. Before we dismiss the father of free thought from our notice, there remains a tribute of respect to be paid to one whom it is our duty to associate with the author of the Leviathan, and who has but just passed away. One man amongst the British aristocracy, with the disposition of a tribune of the people, coupled with thoughts at once elevated and free, and a position which rendered him of essential service to struggling opinion. This man saw the greatness, the profound depth, the Attic style, and the immense importance of the works of Hobbes, along with their systematic depreciation by those whose duty it should be to explain them, especially at a time when those works were not reprinted, and the public were obliged to glean their character from the refutations, so called, by mangled quotations, and a distorted meaning. Impelled by this thought, and anxious to protect the memory of a philosopher, his devoted disciple, at a cost of £10,000, translated the Latin, and edited the English works of Hobbes, in a manner noteworthy alike of the genius of the author, and the discernment of his editor. For this kindness, a seat in Parliament was lost by the organization of the clergy in Cornwall. The name of this man was Sir William Molesworth. Let Freethinkers cherish the memory of their benefactor. We now take our leave of Thomas Hobbes. He had not the chivalry of Herbert, the vivacity of Raleigh, the cumulative power of Bacon, or the winning policy of Locke. If his physical deformities prevented him from being as daring as Vane, he was as bold in thought and expression as either Descartes or his young friend Blount. He gave birth to the brilliant constellation of genius in the time of Queen Anne. He did not live to see his system extensively promulgated, but his principles moulded the character of the men who formed the Revolution of 1688, equally as much as Hume established the Scotch and German schools of philosophy, and Voltaire laid the train by which the French Revolution was proclaimed. Peace to his memory. It was a stormy struggle during his life. Its frowns cannot hurt him now. Could we believe in the idea of a future life, we should invoke his blessings on our cause, that cause which for near 200 years has successfully struggled into birth, to youth and maturity, striking down in its onward course superstitions which hath grown with centuries, and where it does not exterminate them, it supplies a purer atmosphere, and extracts the upper sting which has laid low so many, and which must yet be finally exterminated. The day is rapidly dawning when our only deities will be the works of genius, and our only prayer the remembrance of our most illustrious chiefs. End of Section 1 of Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers by Charles Bradlaugh. Read for you by Ted Delorme.